I'm the sound.
Okay, the interpreter would like me to say a few sentences to adjust the volume. So when she says professor, does she mean professor or professora? I guess professor because she's speaking English. I'm now speaking a few sentences so that she can adjust the volume.
Okay.
Is that good?
But and I think maybe don't know for sure, but I will wait for the need to tell me that everything okay.
Okay, let me just make sure that. Okay, very good. Okay. Hey, Jenny, could you come here for a second? Stay off camera. Okay. Jimmy. Soda, what are we waiting? Are we waiting for something to happen?
No, we are going to begin. Yes, because Denise wasn't hearing you very well, but I hope she now is. Okay. She's here. Yes, it's
just tell me when to begin.
Yeah, I will make a presentation in Portuguese for those who are listening to us, and then I will ask you to begin. Thank you very much. Tá bom. Bem, boa noite. Hoje temos a grande alegria de recebermos o professor Dr. James Gordley como conferencista neste quarto painel sequencial do nosso grupo de estudos de Direito Natural da Faculdade de Direito da UFG, Grupo José Pedro Galvão de Souza. Agradeço muitíssimo a Lepanto Editorial pela intervenção decisiva que é a permissão para a transmissão pelo seu canal no YouTube, aos meus alunos por toda a dedicação para esse evento e à equipe técnica formada pelo casal Gisele Wellington e pelo Gabriel Canedo e pelo nosso amigo Gustavo. A grande distinção que nos faz o Dr. James Russell Gordley nos faz imensa gratidão. O conferencista ingressou como professor na Universidade da Califórnia, ficou até 2007, quando se incorporou ao corpo docente da Escola de Direito da Tulane University, em Nova Orleans, e leciona sobre contratos, responsabilidade civil e direito comparado. Ele é agraciado com vários prêmios, membro ou correspondente de várias academias, British Academy, the Society of Bartolus, and others, e outros. O professor é autor de livros sobre direito comparado, história do direito e sobre contratos. O seu livro, The Philosophical Origins of Modern Contract Doctrine, da Clarendon Law Series, com tradução até em chinês, conferencista. O fôlego dessa obra reside na combinação de profundidade de pesquisa, rigor acadêmico e maestria da escrita, revelando ainda a familiaridade do autor com a metafísica aristotélica e com a filosofia atomista. É, de fato, um livro imperdível para quem se interessa tanto por direito natural quanto por contratos e ainda pela teoria da fixação do preço nos negócios jurídicos. Como os tempos são avessos a longas exposições de currículo, e esta seria bem longa, deixamos as menções neste ponto e passamos a palavra a ele. Welcome, Professor Gordley. My students and I are amidst an attentive audience. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Almost half a century ago, I had a strange and wonderful experience. As a graduate fellow at the Harvard Law School, I listened to a Brazilian professor, Professor Roberto Mangabeira Unger. Professors reacted as the Hebrews did when Jeremiah foretold the ruin of Jerusalem. Some with disbelief, some with awe and fear. Many were sure there was a prophet among us. In the 1970s, Unger's critical legal studies movement was one of the most powerful intellectual forces in American law. In the 1980s, his movement withered. The rule of law still remained. Jerusalem had not fallen, and the interest of American academics had turned elsewhere. Yet they had never answered his arguments, which were strong then and are strong now. If we wish to know why the rule of law is possible, we should carefully consider why Unger thought that it is not. Unger was attacking the positivism and conceptualism which prevailed among jurists in the 19th century. He believed that jurists are still under its shadow. The positivists claimed that their conclusions followed logically from authoritative texts. In France, the authoritative texts were those of the Civil Code. In Germany, they were still those of Roman law contained in the Corpus Juris Civilis in Germany, and of Justinian, at least in much of Germany. They remained in force until the German Civil Code of 1900. In England and the United States, the authoritative texts were the decisions of judges. Jean-Étienne Marie Portalis, the chairman of the committee that drafted the French Civil Code, was not a positivist. He denied that the exegesis of its provisions could resolve all or even most of the cases. No one, he said, pleads against. Nevertheless, in the 19th century, the conviction grew that the code should be interpreted exegetically, without looking beyond its own texts. And so, strangely enough, the code was treated as self-sufficient, even though its drafters had not intended it to be. Perhaps your jurists regarded the Brazilian Civil Code of 1917 as self-sufficient in the same way. That is how jurists of other nations viewed the codes that they adopted. According to the German jurist Savigny, underlying the Roman text was a system of fundamental legal concepts held together by logic. Quote, in every triangle, there are certain given features, the relations of which all the rest are deducible. In like manner, in every part of our law, there are points from which the rest may be given. These may be termed leading axioms. The difficulty is to distinguish them and deduce them from the internal connection. In England and the United States, the authoritative texts were the decisions of judges. New cases were to be decided by a logical exegesis of prior decisions. Judges and commentators merely explained the meaning of decided. To do more would be to make law rather than interpret it. Although the French jurists claimed to derive their conclusions from the Civil Code, the Germans from the Roman texts decided cases. They defined the basic concepts of private law in much the same way. In Germany, France, England, and the United States, property was defined as the will of the owner to do as he chooses with what belongs to him. Contract was defined, tort was defined as the violation of another person's rights, which were defined in terms of the will. As the Germans say, bequeaths jurisprudence. A jurist was supposed to identify the fundamental concepts on which the law was based, to define them, and to deduce the consequences. Conceptualism and positivism went hand in hand. Because concepts could be extracted from the authoritative texts and legal conclusions deduced from the concept was realized, legal conclusions were derived by logic alone from the authoritative texts. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, positivism and conceptualism came under attack. In the United States, by the American legal realists. In Germany, by the Freiheitslistenschule. In France, by the adversaries of the École de l'Exégèse, such as François Genis. They claimed that it was impossible to derive conclusions from authoritative texts by logic alone. They also observed that jurists had failed to do so. The property owner is not exclusively entitled to do as he chooses with his own property. If it's in danger, he can save it by using another person's property against his will. A landowner cannot use his property regardless of the extent to which he interferes with his neighbor's use of their own property. One cannot derive the rules of contract law from a definition of contract as the will of the parties. The parties are bound by many terms that they never considered, and these terms are read into their contract by the law of sales, the law of leases, and so forth. Sometimes the parties are not bound by terms on which they did agree, because the terms are very unfair. One cannot begin with the concept that whoever violates another's rights is liable in tort or delict, and deduce the cases in which the law gives protection. Unger explained why the critics of positivism and conceptualism are right. He drew the extreme conclusion that the rule of law is impossible. He used the word liberalism to refer to positivism and conceptualism. Liberalism rests on what he called the, quote, subjective point of view. Rules are not really right or wrong or just or unjust. They are created ex nihilo by lawmakers. People are supposed to obey them because they have been enacted. The laws may express the values of lawmakers or of citizens or an aggregate of private interests, but without part. The alternative to the rule of law is either anarchy or despotism. Unger argued that if the subjective point of view is correct, the rule of law is impossible. From the subjective point of view, or delict, refer to heterogeneous situations, which are related only because a decision has been made to group them together and refer to them by the same word. The decision could be made by a lawmaker. It could be made by a linguistic convention, which the lawmaker, too much of the makers of laws and linguistic conventions, for them to decide on how a word should apply in an endless number of heterogeneous cases is an endless task. In any event, when the meaning of a word has not been fixed by law or convention, they're to how the word should be interpreted. Yet the need for interpretation will arise whenever a case is litigated. As Portali said, no one pleads against a clear statutory text. Conceptualism thought that they had found an alternative. Law should be interpreted according to their purposes. Unger showed why, if the subjective point of view is correct, that alternative does not work. From a subjective point of view, quote, society is artificial products of the will and interest of individuals. There's no way to determine whose purposes should prevail. Quote, are the policy of the rule he is choosing might have applied to the case with a different result. He cannot do so without, quote, a criterion for the definition of controlling policies, and, quote, a method for balance. First, with a subjective point of view, a neutral criterion and method cannot exist. The purpose theory of legal interpretation, Unger said, quote, leaves the regime of legal justice hanging in the air. According to Unger, these problems arose in the 19th century because people no longer believed in natural law. Of ancient and medieval Europe accepted the view that all things in nature have intelligible essences, and wrong also have essences which thought can comprehend, and therefore moral standards were objective. Quote, the abandonment of the doctrine of intelligible essences meant the acceptance of the subjective conception of value. According to Unger, we cannot go backward. Natural law has been discredited beyond all hope of redemption. Therefore, as soon as we realize the inadequacies of the subjective point of view, the rule of law will pass away. That is how Unger described the future to his classes at Harvard Law School. The next day, his office was filled with students. I believe that in one respect, Unger was right. To believe in the rule of law, one must believe in natural law. In another respect, he was wrong. Unger was not describing the natural law theory of Aquinas, although he claimed to be doing so. He was describing the natural law theory of 17th and 18th century philosophers who broke with the tradition of Leibniz. Among them, Francisco Suarez, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and Christian Wolff. Indeed, Unger does not cite Aquinas. His footnote reads, quote, for the development of this view, see Christian Wolff, Philosophia Prima. The natural law theory of these 17th and 18th century philosophers has often been confused with that of Aquinas. John Rawls, in his book Political Liberalism, contrasted modern liberal views with the older belief in natural law, which he called, quote, rational intuitionalism. As I've shown elsewhere, the theory he called rational intuitionalism was that of Suarez, Leibniz, and Wolff. Indeed, many of the consequences, members failed to see the break that they'd made with the theory of Aquinas. Wolff praised Suarez as the epitome of scholastic philosophy. Liebherr observed that in the 17th century, quote, Suarez did a standard of doctrine for Protestant and Catholic Europe alike. Etienne Gilson said, I practiced this 5 times. This philosophy of Suarez consumed Thomism. Philosophers who teach the ideas of Suarez and imagine that they are those of Aquinas. The theory of Aquinas prevailed for centuries before it was displaced by this later theory of natural law. This later theory was the one discredited by David Hume. The theory of Aquinas is stronger and also more subtle. We will compare the two. It is important to realize how different they are. It is possible. Suarez, Leibniz, and Wolff, moral standards are based on concepts that are eternal and invariable. Leibniz and Wolff liken them to mathematical figures such as circles and triangles. They believed it to be eternally and invariably true on 3 sides. Indeed, they believe that there is an eternal and invariable concept corresponding to everything in the world around you. These concepts have a manner of being of their own. According to Suarez, being has a double meaning. It signifies either being prescinding from actual existence or being as actual existence. A cow you see in the field, a man you see in the street, a triangular object you place on your desk have one sort of being, actual existence. But one can think of a cow, a man, or a triangle without regard to whether there really are any cows, men, or triangles in the world in which we live. For Suarez, Leibniz, and Wolff, those concepts would exist even if there had never been cows, or men, or triangular objects. Moral standards are like that. The concept of justice, for example, is eternally and invariably the same. It would exist even if there were no human beings to behave justly. Leibniz said, a long quotation, "Legal doctrine belongs to those sciences that depend on definitions and demonstrations of reason, as indeed justice consists in some congruity and proportionality. We can understand if there were no one who was acting justly or was being treated justly, in the same way that numbers are true even if there were no one to count and nothing to be counted. And we can predict that a house will be beautiful, a machine efficient, or a commonwealth happy if it comes into being the same certainty as in mathematics. Leibniz's dream was that whenever a moral disputation arose, a moral disagreement arose, he would say, "Sir, let us sit down and calculate the answer." 19th century positivism and conceptualism has a closer resemblance to this theory of natural law than 19th century jurists would have liked to admit. The methods of the positivists were similar, except that the starting points for the 19th century jurists were concepts found in authoritative texts rather than concepts that are eternal and invariable. Conclusions had to follow logically from these starting points, according to Suarez, Leibniz, and Wolff, to have the same certainty as the starting points, and according to the 19th century jurists, to have the same authority. As the method depended on deriving conclusions from contract and tort. As it happens, Leibniz and Wolff, 19th century jurists, property was, I quote Wolff, the right of the owner to dispose of things according to his own judgment. Contract was defined in terms of promise, which was, I quote Wolff, a declaration of the private right of another person. Consequently, one can see the force of Unger's argument in the natural law theory that Unger described, and in which Suarez and Leibniz and Wolff believed. Concepts such as property, indeed, they have a meaning that's fixed for all time. Therefore, these philosophers believed that one could derive these concepts in the same way as in mathematics. The 19th century jurists made no such claim. Concepts had no maker meant by them. If so, there was no way to extend the meaning of the words the lawmaker used to include anything beyond the narrow scope of what he actually meant. And that was Unger's argument. The theory of natural law of Aquinas was quite different. Aquinas, like Aristotle, distinguished between theoretical and practical reason. Theoretical reason examines the implications of concepts which the mind abstracts from triangular objects. Practical reason, which Aquinas called prudentia and Aristotle called phronesis, makes a judgment as to what action can be purposes or ends is, quote, a decree of practical reason. Theoretical and practical reason proceed from first, it cannot demonstrate. If he could demonstrate them, they would not be first principles. Among the first principles of theoretical reason, for example, is the law true and false at the same time in the same way. There is no way to demonstrate that law from any higher principle. Any demonstration would presuppose that it is true. Or to deny the law of non-contradiction, the only way to refute him would be by what Aristotle calls a dialectical argument. He cannot be refuted as long as he remains silent. Should he affirm anything, however, then he must concede that the law of non-contradiction is true. Otherwise, what he affirmed to be true would also be false. It is so, Aquinas said, with the first principles of practical reason, which have the character of ends. A human being knows that certain ends are good. He knows, for example, that it's good to prefer knowledge to ignorance, beauty to ugliness, to help others rather than to harm them. He knows these ends are good without being taught. It must be dialectical. Such a person cannot be refuted as long as he does not do anything. But if he acts for any purpose, he cannot deny that some purposes are worth pursuing. It's important not to confuse that position concerning the source of moral standards with other positions that sound like it. Given the way we are constructed, we do recognize that certain ends are good. But the ends are not good merely because, given the way we're constructed, we cannot think otherwise. We know that certain ends really are good. The proof, again, is dialectical. A person who believes a purpose is really not worth pursuing, but only seems worth pursuing because of the way he's constructed. He claimed that any version of natural